The flame consumed the edge of the paper, curling it into ash as Theodora Newcomb watched with tearful defiance, each letter a piece of her shattered heart fed to the merciless wind. She hadn't noticed Caleb Nordstrom watching from his position against the stable door, his weathered hat pulled low over observant eyes that missed nothing in Aurora, Colorado. Not even a woman with fire in her hands and grief etched across her face. It was the autumn of 1878, and Aurora was still finding its footing as a frontier town. The railroad had brought people, prosperity, and problems in equal measure. Theodora to those who knew her well, had arrived 6 months earlier, a puzzle that Caleb had been trying to solve without quite admitting why he cared. "You know, those words won't burn away from your memory just because you're turning them to ash," Caleb finally said, stepping forward and revealing his presence. Thea startled, nearly dropping the letter in her hand. Her copper hair gleamed in the late afternoon sun, rebellious strands escaping from her practical bun. "Mr. Nordstrom," she acknowledged, her voice clipped. "I wasn't aware I had an audience." "Wasn't trying to be one," he replied, his boots scuffing the dirt. "Just happened to be tending to my horse when I noticed the fire." She straightened her back, dignity wrapping around her like armor. "Well, now you can unnotice it. This is private business." Caleb nodded slowly, studying the woman before him. At 26, he'd seen enough of life to recognize pain when it wore a human face. Private business tends to stay that way better when it's not conducted behind the public stables, he pointed out. For a moment, Thea looked ready to lash out, but then her shoulders slumped. "I suppose you're right." She gestured to the small pile of ashes gathering at her feet. "These needed burning, and my boarding house doesn't allow fires in the rooms. Letters from someone who hurt you. It wasn't really a question." He'd seen the way she'd been studying each one before feeding it to the flames, as if memorizing the words one last time. "Someone who lied," she corrected, her green eyes flashing. "There's a difference." Caleb leaned against the weathered wood of the stable. At 30, he had established himself as one of Aurora's most reliable horsemen, an occasional deputy, when Sheriff Morgan needed an extra gun. He wasn't one to pry into others' affairs, but something about Theodora Newcomb had caught his attention from the moment she'd stepped off the eastbound train. "Lying and hurting tend to go hand in hand," he observed. Thea looked down at the final letter in her hand. "This is the last one," she said, almost to herself. "After this, it's over." "Endings often make way for beginnings," Caleb said, then winced at his own words. "Sorry, my mother had a saying for everything. Some of them stuck." A ghost of a smile touched Thea's lips. "Your mother sounds wise." She struck a match and held it to the corner of the final letter, watching as the flame crawled across the paper, devouring words that had once meant everything to her. The wind picked up, carrying the ashes skyward in a swirling dance. Both of them watched in silence until the last fragment disappeared from sight. "There," she said, finality in her voice. "It's done." Caleb hesitated before speaking. "Miss Newcomb, I don't mean to overstep, but would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee? The evening's getting cold and—" "Mr. Nordstrom," she interrupted, her expression softening slightly. "I appreciate the gesture, but I've just finished burning the remnants of one man's false promises. I'm not eager to invite conversation with another." He nodded, taking the rejection with grace. "Fair enough. Just thought you might want somewhere warm to sit for a spell. Thank you, but no." She gathered her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Good evening, Mr. Nordstrom." Caleb watched her walk away, her spine straight as a ramrod despite whatever weight she carried. There was a story there, one that had brought her all the way from wherever she'd come from to this growing town on the Colorado frontier. He wondered if he'd ever learn what it was. The next morning found Thea at her post in Aurora's general store, where she had secured employment shortly after her arrival. Mr. Hollister, the proprietor, was a fair employer who valued her education and meticulous record-keeping. The position didn't pay as well as her previous work as a teacher back east, but it provided enough for her modest room at Mrs. Winslow's boarding house and the occasional small luxury. "Morning, Miss Newcomb," came a familiar voice that made Thea look up from the inventory ledger. Caleb Nordstrom stood before the counter, hat in hand, looking far more presentable than he had the previous evening by the stables. "Mr. Nordstrom," she acknowledged with professional courtesy. "How may I help you today?" "Need some coffee and a few other supplies," he said, placing a list on the counter. "Heading out to check on the Wilcox place tomorrow. Old man Wilcox broke his leg last month and his son's been struggling with the horses." Thea nodded and began gathering the items on his list. "That's kind of you to help. It's work," he corrected without heat. "They're paying me fair to train a few colts and help with the breaking." She moved efficiently around the store, collecting his supplies. Still, not everyone would make the ride out there. "It's nearly a day's journey if I recall correctly." "You recall correctly," he said, watching her work. "You've got quite a memory for someone who's only been in Aurora a short time." Thea paused, a can of peaches in her hand. "I pay attention to details. It serves me well." "I imagine it does." He leaned against the counter, not in a presumptuous way, but with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "You know, I never did properly introduce myself yesterday. Caleb Nordstrom, at your service." "Theodora Newcomb," she replied, though they both knew formal introductions were unnecessary at this point. "They'll most call me Thea." "Thea," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt. "It suits you better than Theodora, less formal." "I'm not sure I've given you cause to judge what level of formality suits me, Mr. Nordstrom." She placed the last of his supplies on the counter, tallying the cost with practiced efficiency. He smiled, not at all put off by her coolness. "No, I suppose you haven't." "That'll be my cue to mind my manners." As she wrapped his purchases in brown paper, he noticed a small tremor in her hands, almost imperceptible, but his eye was trained to catch the smallest details in horse and human alike. "Are you all right, Miss Newcomb?" She secured the package with twine, her movements precise despite the slight shake. "Perfectly fine, thank you. That will be $2.17. Caleb placed $3 on the counter. "Keep the change. The store doesn't accept tips, Mr. Nordstrom." "Then consider it a donation to whatever cause Mr. Hollister is supporting this month." He picked up his bundle. "I'll be back in about a week once the job at Wilcox's is done." Thea found herself nodding. "Safe travels." As he turned to leave, he paused. "Those letters you were burning yesterday are no longer any concern of mine," she cut him off, her voice firm. "I was going to say that whatever story they told, it clearly wasn't worthy of you." His eyes, the color of a summer storm, held hers for a moment. "Not everyone breaks their word, Miss Newcomb." Before she could respond, he was gone, the bell above the door signaling his departure. Thea stood motionless behind the counter, his words echoing in her mind. They stirred something she had vowed to keep dormant: hope. And hope, she had learned the hard way, was a dangerous thing for a woman alone on the frontier. That evening, as Thea prepared for bed in her small room at Mrs. Winslow's boarding house, she found herself thinking of Caleb Nordstrom despite her best intentions. There was something straightforward about him that contrasted sharply with Philip's polished charm, the man whose letters she had committed to flame. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Miss Newcomb." Mrs. Winslow's voice was hushed but urgent. "There's someone downstairs asking for you. A man." Thea's heart stuttered. Did he give a name? says he's Philip Harrington, come all the way from Boston, says it's most urgent he speak with you. The blood drained from Thea's face. Philip, here in Aurora. The very man whose promises and betrayals she had tried to burn away just yesterday. Tell him, she started, then stopped, gathering her resolve. Tell him I'll be down shortly. She quickly dressed, pinning her hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her hands were steadier now than they had been in the store. Anger had a way of steadying her when nothing else could. Philip stood in Mrs. Winslow's modest parlor, looking as out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. His tailored suit and polished boots spoke of Eastern wealth that few in Aurora could claim. When he saw her, his face brightened with that same winning smile that had once made her heart race. Now it only made her stomach turn. "Thea, my darling," he said, stepping toward her with arms outstretched. She remained by the doorway, maintaining her distance. "Mr. Harrington, this is unexpected." His smile faltered at her formality. "Surely we're beyond such formalities, Thea. After everything we've shared, what are you doing in Aurora?" she interrupted, unwilling to let him reminisce about a relationship that had been built on deception. "I've come for you, of course." He looked around the parlor with barely disguised disdain. "To bring you back where you belong." "And where is that exactly?" "Boston, where you neglected to mention your engagement to Constance Sheffield while courting me. Or perhaps New York, where you promised to meet me but never appeared." Philip had the grace to look abashed. "I can explain all of that if you'll give me the chance." "The engagement to Constance was arranged by our families, but I've broken it off. I've been searching for you for months. How convenient that you found me just as I was finally putting your memory behind me." Thea crossed her arms. "I burned your letters yesterday, Philip. Every last one." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Letters can be rewritten, Thea, promises renewed. I've made mistakes, grievous ones, but my feelings for you were never false." For a fleeting moment, Thea felt the pull of what might have been. Philip had been charming, educated, and had seemed to value her mind as much as her companionship. Their courtship, conducted largely through correspondence after their initial meeting at her school in Philadelphia, had been filled with shared intellectual passions and dreams of a future together. But then had come the revelation of his engagement, his failure to meet her in New York as promised, and finally, the devastating letter explaining that family obligations made their match impossible. "Your feelings may have been real," she conceded, "but they weren't strong enough to overcome the obstacles. And now, after I've built a new life, you expect me to simply return with you. I've changed, Thea. I've broken from my family's expectations. I'm my own man now." He reached for her hand. "Give me a chance to prove it to you." She withdrew her hand before he could touch it. "I need time to think." Philip nodded, relief evident on his face. "Of course. I've taken a room at the hotel. I'll call on you tomorrow. I work at the general store until 5. "Then I shall come at 6, he said, reaching for his hat. "Good night, Thea, and thank you for at least hearing me out." After he left, Thea sat heavily in one of Mrs. Winslow's worn armchairs, her mind reeling. Just when she had convinced herself she was free of Philip's influence, he had appeared in person to reignite all the complicated feelings she had tried so hard to extinguish. "Well, he seems like quite the gentleman," Mrs. Winslow remarked, bringing in a cup of tea for Thea. "Is he the reason you came west?" Thea accepted the tea gratefully. "In a manner of speaking, he's the reason I left the East, but not because I was following him." Mrs. Winslow, a widow of 50 with keen eyes and a kind heart, settled into the chair opposite. "Running from then?" "Running from the humiliation, perhaps." Thea sipped her tea, finding comfort in its warmth. "He was engaged to another woman the entire time he was corresponding with me." Mrs. Winslow clicked her tongue disapprovingly. Men like that are the same whether they wear fancy suits or cowboy boots. Full of promises until something better comes along. Thea thought suddenly of Caleb Nordstrom's parting words. Not everyone breaks their word. There had been something solid about him, something authentic that Philip, for all his polish and education, seemed to lack. "I don't know what to do," Thea admitted. "Part of me still cares for him, despite everything." Mrs. Winslow patted her hand. "Sleep on it, dear. Morning often brings clarity where night brings confusion." But sleep eluded Thea that night, her mind alternating between memories of Philip's betrayal and the unexpected appearance of Caleb Nordstrom in her life. Two men, as different as day and night, each pulling at different parts of her heart. By morning, she was no closer to a decision, but she had resolved to at least hear Philip out. After all, he had traveled a considerable distance to find her. The least she could do was listen to his explanation before sending him away again. The day passed in a blur of customers and ledgers, with Thea constantly checking the clock, dreading and anticipating Philip's arrival in equal measure. At 5 o'clock, she closed the store and hurried back to the boarding house to change into her best dress, a practical navy blue with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Philip arrived precisely at 6, carrying a bouquet of flowers that must have cost a small fortune in a frontier town like Aurora. "You look beautiful," he said as Mrs. Winslow showed him into the parlor. "Thank you." Thea accepted the flowers with a polite smile. "Shall we walk? The evening is pleasant, and I find I think more clearly in the open air." They strolled down Aurora's main street, Philip offering his arm, which Thea accepted more out of ingrained courtesy than desire for closeness. He spoke of his journey west, of his break with his family's expectations, of his realization that she was the only woman who truly understood him. "I've secured a position at a law firm in Denver," he explained as they passed the saloon, where piano music spilled into the street. "It's not Boston, but it's civilized enough. We could have a good life there, Thea. You could teach again, or simply manage our home if you preferred." "You've planned quite thoroughly," she observed, noting how he had already mapped out their future without consulting her. "I want to show you I'm serious." He stopped, turning to face her. "I've made terrible mistakes, Thea, unforgivable ones. But I'm asking for forgiveness anyway, because what we could still have is worth fighting for." Thea looked into his earnest face, remembering how she had once thought those blue eyes held all the answers to her future happiness. Now she wasn't so sure. "I need more time, Philip. This is all very sudden." He nodded, though disappointment shadowed his features. "Of course, I understand. But I won't give up easily this time, Thea. I'll prove to you that I've changed." As they turned to head back toward the boarding house, Thea caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Caleb Nordstrom, who should have been miles away at the Wilcox Ranch, was standing outside the telegraph office, watching them with an unreadable expression. Their eyes met briefly before he touched the brim of his hat in silent acknowledgement and disappeared into the building. "Someone you know?" Philip asked, following her gaze. "Just a customer from the store," Thea replied, an unexpected pang of guilt coloring her words. What did she have to feel guilty about? Caleb was nothing to her, barely an acquaintance. And yet, seeing him had stirred something that Philip's flowery speeches had not. Over the next few days, Philip's courtship was as persistent as it was public. He called at the store with small gifts, escorted her to dinner at Aurora's modest hotel restaurant, and charmed Mrs. Winslow with stories of Eastern society. The town buzzed with gossip about the sophisticated Easterner who had followed Theodora Newcomb all the way to Colorado. Thea found herself swept up in the attention, reminded of the parts of Philip she had genuinely cared for. His quick mind, his knowledge of literature and art, his ability to make her laugh. But beneath it all ran an undercurrent of doubt. Had he really changed? Or was this just another performance that would end when the curtain fell, on the fourth evening of Philip's stay in Aurora? As they returned from another walk, they found Caleb Nordstrom sitting on the porch of Mrs. Winslow's boarding house, deep in conversation with the landlady herself. "Mr. Nordstrom," Thea said, surprise evident in her voice. "I thought you were at the Wilcox Ranch." Caleb stood, hat in hand. "Finished early. The young Wilcox boy's a quick learner." His eyes shifted to Philip, taking his measure with a single glance. "Evening. Philip Harrington," Philip introduced himself, extending a hand that Caleb shook briefly. "Are you a boarder here as well?" "No, Mr. Nordstrom was just returning a book he borrowed, Mrs. Winslow explained, holding up a volume of Tennyson's poetry. "And delivering some fresh eggs from his hens. Most considerate." "Just being neighborly," Caleb said, his eyes finding Thea's again. There was something in his gaze that asked questions he wouldn't voice aloud. "I should be heading back." "Got horses to tend to?" "Of course," Thea said, feeling strangely torn. "Thank you for the eggs." Caleb nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Miss Newcomb, Mr. Harrington, Mrs. Winslow." With a final tip of his hat, he descended the porch steps and headed toward the stables where he kept his horse. "Interesting fellow," Philip remarked as they watched him go. "Rather rough around the edges." Mrs. Winslow gave him a sharp look. "Mr. Nordstrom is one of the most respected men in Aurora. Saved half the town's livestock during last winter's blizzard by leading them to shelter when no one else would risk the storm." Philip raised his hands in apology. "I meant no offense. I'm sure he's a fine man." Later that night, as Thea prepared for bed, she found herself drawn to her window, which overlooked the quiet street. In the distance, she could see the light still burning in the small cabin at the edge of town that Caleb called home. What was he doing up so late, and why did she care? The next morning brought an unexpected encounter. Thea had risen early to help Mrs. Winslow with breakfast preparations when a knock came at the door. Opening it, she found Caleb standing there, holding the reins of a saddled horse. "Mr. Nordstrom, is everything all right?" "Morning, Miss Newcomb." He looked somewhat uncomfortable, as if he'd been wrestling with a decision. "I wondered if you might like to ride out to see the wildflowers blooming in the North Meadow. They only last a few days this time of year." Thea blinked in surprise. It's just that you mentioned once to Mrs. Winslow that you missed the wildflowers from back east," he continued, words coming faster now. "And these aren't the same, but they're something special." She hesitated, aware that accepting would mean postponing her planned breakfast with Philip. Yet there was something in Caleb's invitation that called to her, a simplicity and sincerity that stood in stark contrast to Philip's calculated courtship. "I'd like that," she said before she could second-guess herself. "Let me leave a note for Mrs. Winslow and change into something more suitable for riding." Relief and pleasure mingled in his expression. "Take your time. I'll wait here." 20 minutes later, Thea emerged in her simplest skirt and blouse, her hair braided practically down her back. Caleb helped her mount the gentle mare he had brought for her, his hands strong and steady as he adjusted the stirrups to her height. They rode in comfortable silence away from town, the morning sun warming their backs. Aurora fell away behind them, and soon they were surrounded by the open prairie, dotted with scrubby pines and the occasional outcropping of rock. "I've never been this far from town," Thea admitted, taking in the vast landscape. "Most folks haven't," Caleb replied. "They stick to what they know, miss out on what's beyond." There was wisdom in his simple observation that made Thea study him with new interest. "How did you come to Aurora, Mr. Nordstrom?" Caleb he corrected gently. Seems silly to stand on formality when we're the only two people for miles. She smiled despite herself. Caleb, then. I came through with a cattle drive about 5 years back, he explained, guiding his horse around a rocky patch. Liked the look of the place. Decided to stay when the outfit moved on. Worked odd jobs until I saved enough to buy a small piece of land and build my cabin. Started training horses, which I'd done since I was a boy back in Texas. You left the cattle drive just like that. Weren't you afraid of starting over in a strange place? He considered this. Wasn't the first time I'd started over. Won't be the last, I expect. Life has a way of keeping you moving. He glanced at her. What about you? What brought you all the way from Philadelphia to Aurora? Thea looked ahead, where the land seemed to stretch endlessly toward the mountains. I needed to go somewhere no one knew me, somewhere I could reinvent myself. Because of the man who wrote those letters, the one who's come looking for you now. She nodded, surprised by his directness but not offended by it. There was nothing calculating in his question, just genuine interest. Philip and I met when he visited the school where I taught, she explained. He was there on behalf of a benefactor. We connected over books and ideas. Our courtship was mostly through letters, but I believed we had an understanding. Until you didn't, Caleb supplied, not unkindly. Until I discovered he was engaged to someone else the entire time. He wrote to tell me he couldn't break the engagement, family obligations, financial considerations, all very practical reasons that meant nothing to my broken heart. She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but there was something about the open sky and Caleb's steady presence that invited honesty. And now he's here, wanting another chance. He says he's broken off his engagement, that he's changed, she sighed. I want to believe him, but I'm not the same woman who fell in love with his letters. I'm not sure I can go back to being her. Caleb nodded, understanding in his eyes. Here we are, he said, pointing ahead to a gentle slope covered in a riot of color: purple, yellow, white, and blue wildflowers carpeting the earth as far as the eye could see. Thea gasped at the unexpected beauty. It's magnificent. They dismounted, and Caleb secured the horses before leading her into the heart of the meadow. She walked among the flowers, touching their delicate petals with wonder. I've never seen anything like this, she admitted, turning to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart quicken. Not many have, he said quietly. It's here and gone so quick, most folks miss it. They spent the morning in the meadow, talking of simple things: her work at the store, his horses, the changing seasons in Colorado. Caleb told her about growing up in Texas, learning horsemanship from his father, losing both parents to fever when he was 16, and making his own way ever since. Thea shared stories of her childhood in Philadelphia, her love of teaching, and her dreams of someday writing stories of her own. As the sun climbed higher, they reluctantly mounted their horses to return to town. Thea felt lighter somehow, as if the open sky and honest conversation had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. As they approached Aurora, Caleb broke their comfortable silence. Miss Newcomb, Thea, I hope you don't think I was overstepping by asking you out here today. Not at all, she assured him. I've enjoyed it immensely. Good. He seemed to gather his courage, because I'd like to be clear about something. I'm interested in you not just as a friend or neighbor. I have been since you arrived in Aurora. The directness of his declaration took her breath away. There were no flowery speeches or grand promises, just a simple truth offered without expectation. I know you've got complications with this Philip fellow, Caleb continued, and I'm not asking you for anything right now. Just wanted you to know where I stand. Thea didn't know how to respond. Part of her was flattered by his interest, even drawn to his straightforward nature. But Philip's return had reopened wounds she thought healed and stirred feelings she believed buried. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't need to say anything," he assured her. "Just thought you should know you have options." As they rode into town, Thea saw Philip waiting outside the boarding house, his expression darkening when he spotted her with Caleb. "I should go," she said, suddenly anxious. Caleb helped her dismount, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "Remember what I said about those letters you burned. The ashes blowing away doesn't erase what was written, but it does mean you don't have to carry them anymore." With that cryptic observation, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving her to face Philip's questions and her own conflicted heart. Philip was politely furious, his anger contained behind a veneer of concern. "I was worried sick. Mrs. Winslow said you'd gone riding, but she didn't know where or with whom." "I'm perfectly fine, as you can see," Thea replied, her newfound confidence surprising her. The morning with Caleb had reminded her of her own strength and independence. "Mr. Nordstrom showed me the wildflower meadows north of town." "Nordstrom," Philip repeated, distaste evident. "The cowboy. Thea, you cannot seriously be entertaining the attentions of such a man." "And why not?" she challenged, stepping past him into the boarding house. "He's respected in this community. He works hard and deals honestly with people." Philip followed her inside. "He's uneducated, uncultured. What could you possibly have in common? More than you might think." She turned to face him in the empty parlor. "Philip, I appreciate that you've come all this way, but I'm not the same woman you corresponded with. I've built a life here, made my own decisions." "A life," he scoffed. "Working in a general store in a dusty frontier town. This isn't a life, Thea, it's hiding." His words stung because there was a kernel of truth to them. She had come to Aurora to escape the humiliation of his betrayal, not because she had chosen the town on its own merits. "Perhaps it started that way," she acknowledged, "but I've found a community here. People who value me for who I am, not who they expect me to be." "I value you," Philip insisted, taking her hands in his. "I always have. That's why I couldn't let you go, why I had to find you to make things right between us." Thea looked into his handsome face, remembering all the dreams she had once built around his letters. It would be so easy to believe him, to slip back into the comfort of those dreams. "I need more time," she said finally, withdrawing her hands from his. "This is all happening so fast." Philip's expression hardened slightly before smoothing into understanding. "Of course, but I can't stay in Aurora indefinitely, Thea. I have to return to Denver next week to begin my new position." "I understand. Come with me," he urged. "Start fresh in Denver. It's a growing city with opportunities for someone with your education and refinement. You could teach again." The offer was tempting in its own way. Denver was certainly more cultured than Aurora, with its theaters and libraries that she sometimes missed. And teaching had been her passion before circumstances had forced her to flee Philadelphia. "Let me think about it," she said. Over the next few days, Thea found herself torn between two futures. The sophisticated life Philip offered in Denver, with its cultural advantages and connection to her past, or the simpler but perhaps more authentic existence she had begun to build in Aurora, one that now included the possibility of Caleb Nordstrom. She saw both men during this time. Philip continued his campaign of attentions, bringing gifts, escorting her to dinner, painting vivid pictures of the life they could share in Denver. His charm was undeniable, and there were moments when she could almost forget his past betrayal. Caleb was more restrained, respecting her need to sort through her feelings. He would stop by the store on legitimate errands, exchange a few words with her, sometimes walk her home if their paths crossed at the end of the day. There were no grand gestures, just small kindnesses and honest conversation that made her feel seen in a way Philip's elaborate courtship did not. On the evening before Philip planned to leave for Denver, he invited Thea to dinner at the hotel, clearly intending it as the moment for her decision. "I've booked 2 seats on tomorrow's stage to Denver," he told her over dessert. "I hope you'll take the second one." Thea set down her fork, the sweet taste of apple pie turning to ash in her mouth. "You assumed my answer before asking the question." Philip reached across the table for her hand. "I believed in the strength of what we once had, what we could have again." "Is that so wrong?" Before she could respond, commotion erupted in the street outside. People were shouting, and through the window, Thea could see the orange glow of flames. "Fire!" someone yelled, bursting into the dining room. "Fire at the livery stable!" Diners rose in alarm, rushing outside to see what was happening. Thea and Philip followed, emerging into chaos as townspeople formed a bucket brigade from the water trough to the stable, where flames were already consuming the dry wood structure. "The horses!" someone cried. "They're still inside." Through the smoke and confusion, Thea saw Caleb sprint toward the burning building, ignoring shouts to stay back. Terror seized her heart as he disappeared into the inferno. Long minutes passed as the bucket brigade fought to contain the blaze. Thea stood frozen, eyes fixed on the stable entrance, willing Caleb to emerge. Philip stood beside her, a steadying hand on her arm that she barely registered. Finally, incredibly, Caleb appeared through the smoke, leading 2 terrified horses. He handed them off to waiting hands before turning back toward the fire. "Nordstrom, no," Sheriff Morgan called. "The roof's about to go." But Caleb had already plunged back into the burning stable. Thea's heart stopped as a terrible cracking sound split the air, followed by a crash as part of the roof collapsed. "Caleb!" she screamed, starting forward only to be held back by Philip. "You can't go in there," he said firmly. "It's suicide." She struggled against his grip. "Let me go." Just then, there was movement at a side entrance to the stable that few had noticed in the chaos. Caleb emerged, coughing and soot-covered, supporting the elderly stable owner, Mr. Dawson, who appeared injured but alive. Relief flooded through Thea with such force that her knees nearly buckled. As others rushed to help Mr. Dawson, Caleb sank to the ground, clearly exhausted from his heroic efforts. Without hesitation, Thea broke free from Philip and ran to Caleb's side, kneeling beside him in the dirt without regard for her dress. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking as she brushed soot from his face with trembling fingers. He looked up at her through reddened eyes. "Couldn't leave old Dawson or the horses," he said simply, his voice raspy from smoke. "Doctor." Harrison, Aurora's physician, appeared beside them. "Let's get him to my office to check those lungs," he said, helping Caleb to his feet. "I'll come with you," Thea said immediately, supporting Caleb's other side. "Thea," Philip called, still standing where she had left him. "What about our discussion?" She turned back briefly. "I think I just made my decision, Philip." The look of understanding and resignation that crossed his face told her he had seen what perhaps she herself had only just realized. Her heart had already chosen. At the doctor's office, Thea waited anxiously while Dr. Harrison examined Caleb. When she was finally allowed to see him, he was sitting up on the examination table, breathing in steam from a bowl of hot water infused with eucalyptus. "He's inhaled a fair amount of smoke, Doctor," Harrison explained, "but his lungs are strong. He needs rest and to continue with the steam treatments for a few days." "I'll make sure he follows orders," Thea promised, her gaze fixed on Caleb's face. When the doctor left them alone, an awkward silence fell. Caleb broke it first. "You didn't have to stay." "Yes, I did." She moved closer, taking his soot-stained hand in hers. "When I saw you run into that fire, I realized something. The thought of losing you before I even had a chance to know you properly, it terrified me more than anything ever has." Something flickered in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or disbelief. "What about Harrington? Thought you two had history." "History is the right word for it," she said softly. "What Philip and I had belongs in the past. I burned those letters for a reason." "And yet you've been spending every day with him since he arrived," Caleb pointed out, wincing slightly as a coughing fit overtook him. When he recovered, Thea handed him a glass of water. "I needed to be sure," she explained, "to know if what I felt for him was truly gone or just buried. Turns out it was ashes all along, I just hadn't let the wind take them yet." Caleb studied her face, searching for certainty. "And now I know what I want." She squeezed his hand. "If you're still interested." The slow smile that spread across his face lit something warm inside her. "I reckon I am," he said, "though I'm not much to look at right now." "You look perfect to me," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. The next morning, Thea stood at the stagecoach stop, watching as Philip loaded his luggage for the journey to Denver. He had taken her decision with more grace than she might have expected, though the hurt in his eyes was unmistakable. "I can't say I'm not disappointed," he told her as they said their goodbyes. "But I understand. Perhaps I was too late." "It wasn't a matter of timing," Thea said gently. "We were never quite right for each other, Philip. I think part of me always knew that, even before I discovered your engagement." He nodded, accepting her words with resignation. "He's a fortunate man, your Mr. Nordstrom. I hope he realizes that. I believe he does." She offered her hand, which Philip took, pressing a final kiss to her knuckles. "Goodbye, Thea. I wish you happiness." "And I wish the same for you, Philip." As the stagecoach pulled away, Thea felt a strange mixture of closure and anticipation. One chapter of her life was truly ending, while another was just beginning to unfold. She walked slowly back through town, her steps lighter than they had been in months. Outside the general store, she found Caleb waiting, looking considerably better than he had the night before, though still bearing the marks of his ordeal. "Thought you might want company for a while," he said, falling into step beside her. "If you're not busy." "I'm not busy at all," she replied, smiling up at him. "In fact, I have the whole day ahead of me." "In that case," he said, offering his arm, "would you like to take a walk with me? There's a lot of Aurora you haven't seen yet." She took his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. "I'd like that very much." As they strolled through the town that had become her refuge and was now becoming her home, Thea thought about the letters she had burned, the ashes carried away by the wind. In letting go of the past, she had opened herself to a future she hadn't imagined possible, one filled with wildflower meadows and honest conversations, simple joys and profound connections. It wasn't the life she had planned when she'd boarded the train east from Philadelphia 6 months ago, but standing beside Caleb Nordstrom in the warm Colorado sunshine, she knew it was exactly where she was meant to be. Over the next few months, Thea and Caleb's relationship blossomed like the wildflowers in the meadow where they had first begun to know each other. Their courtship was unhurried and genuine, built on shared conversations, mutual respect, and a deepening affection that surprised them both with its intensity. Caleb introduced her to the beauty of the Colorado wilderness, taking her on rides to secluded valleys and breathtaking vistas that few townspeople ever ventured to see. Thea shared her love of literature with him, reading aloud by lamplight on quiet evenings on his porch. They discovered common ground in their love of learning. Caleb might lack formal education, but his mind was quick and curious, absorbing knowledge with an eagerness that matched her own. By the time winter settled over Aurora, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a glittering wonderland, Thea had moved from Mrs. Winslow's boarding house into a small cottage near the schoolhouse. The town had grown enough that the school board had approached her about resuming her teaching career, an opportunity she had embraced with enthusiasm. "How was your first day with the little hellions?" Caleb asked as he stomped snow from his boots on her porch one December evening. Thea laughed, opening the door wider to admit him. "They're hardly hellions. Energetic, yes, but eager to learn. Even Tommy Pearson, despite his best efforts to appear otherwise." Caleb hung his coat on the hook by the door, bringing with him the scent of cold air and pine. "That one's trouble. Takes after his father." "He's bright," she countered, leading the way to her small kitchen where stew simmered on the stove. "Just needs the right challenges to channel that energy." As they settled at her table for the simple meal she had prepared, Thea marveled at the easy domesticity they had developed. There was nothing forced or artificial about their relationship. It had grown naturally, like a tree finding its way toward sunlight. "Got something to ask you," Caleb said as they finished eating, his expression suddenly serious. Thea's heart quickened. "Oh," he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Been thinking about the future. My cabin's too small for more than one person, and your place here is fine for a teacher, but, she prompted, hardly daring to breathe. "I've been saving up. Bought a piece of land about 2 miles out of town. Good water, good grazing, room to build something proper." He met her eyes directly. "Something that could be ours if you wanted." "Caleb Nordstrom," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "Are you proposing to me over a half-eaten bowl of stew?" A flush crept up his neck. "Doing a poor job of it, seems like." "On the contrary," she said, squeezing his hand. "I think it's perfectly us." "Is that a yes, then?" "It's a yes," she confirmed, her heart full to bursting. "Though I should warn you, I've never been much of a rancher's wife." He stood, pulling her up and into his arms. "And I've never been much of a teacher's husband. Reckon we'll figure it out together." Their wedding took place in early spring, just as the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom across the prairie. It was a simple ceremony in Aurora's small church, attended by the townspeople who had become Thea's adoptive family. Mrs. Winslow wept openly, declaring she had known all along that the two were meant for each other. Sheriff Morgan served as Caleb's best man, while Thea was attended by Mary Hollister, the storekeeper's daughter who had become a dear friend. They moved into Caleb's cabin temporarily, while their new home was being built on the land he had purchased. It was a cozy arrangement that tested their patience at times, but ultimately strengthened their bond, as they learned to navigate shared space and merged lives. By summer, the frame of their new house stood proudly against the Colorado sky, a sturdy 2-story structure with large windows to capture the sweeping views and plenty of room for the family they hoped to build together. "It's perfect," Thea said as they stood hand in hand, surveying their future home one warm July evening. "Not finished yet," Caleb reminded her, though pride was evident in his voice. "Still needs the roof and all the interior work." "I can see it already," she assured him, leaning against his shoulder. "The kitchen with the big stove you promised, the bookshelves in the parlor, the bedrooms upstairs." She hesitated slightly before adding, "including the nursery." Caleb went very still beside her. "Nursery." She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "I think we might need it sooner rather than later." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a joy so pure it took her breath away. "Are you saying—" "Yes," she confirmed, laughing as he swept her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the ground. "Sometime in winter, according to Dr. Harrison." That night, as they lay together in the narrow bed of the cabin that had been their first shared home, Caleb placed a gentle hand on Thea's still flat stomach. "Never thought I'd have this," he admitted, his voice hushed in the darkness. "A wife, a child, a real home. After my parents died, I figured I'd always be drifting. And I never thought I'd find happiness so far from everything I knew," Thea replied, covering his hand with her own. "Life has a way of surprising you." "Best kind of surprise," he murmured, pulling her closer. The months passed in a blur of activity as they raced to complete their home before winter and the baby arrived. The town rallied around them, with neighbors helping to raise the roof and finish the interior, while Thea continued teaching until her condition made it impractical. In December, just as the first heavy snows blanketed Aurora, they moved into their completed home, a warm haven against the winter's chill, with a nursery painted in soft yellow awaiting its tiny occupant. The baby, however, had plans of his own. On a bitterly cold January night, during one of the worst blizzards in living memory, Thea went into labor a full 2 weeks earlier than expected. "Can't get to town in this," Caleb said grimly, looking out at the swirling snow that had already drifted halfway up their door. "And can't get the doctor here." "Then we'll manage ourselves," Thea replied, gritting her teeth against a contraction. "Women have been having babies without doctors since the beginning of time." Caleb's face was a mask of barely controlled panic. "Not my wife, not our child." "Listen to me," she said, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "You've delivered foals and calves. The principle is the same. We can do this, Caleb." And somehow they did. Through a night that seemed endless, with only flickering lamplight and their determination to guide them, they brought their son into the world, a robust boy with Caleb's dark hair, and when he finally opened them, Thea's green eyes. "Christopher," Thea said softly, cradling the swaddled infant as dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape. "After your father." Caleb, exhausted but exhilarated, sat beside her on the bed they had shared for less than a month in their new home. "Christopher Thomas Nordstrom," he agreed, adding her father's name as a middle name. "Welcome home, son." When spring finally thawed the frozen land, they took Christopher to Aurora to be properly baptized in the church and introduced to the community that had embraced them. The town celebrated the first child born to Thea and Caleb with a picnic that stretched along the main street, everyone contributing dishes and gifts for the new family. "Never seen a baby cause such a fuss," Sheriff Morgan commented, awkwardly holding his honorary nephew while Thea and Caleb enjoyed a rare moment to eat uninterrupted. "He's special," Mrs. Winslow declared, hovering nearby to ensure the sheriff didn't drop her precious godson. First of a new generation for Aurora. As the years passed, that new generation grew, with Christopher joined by a sister, Elena, 2 years later, and eventually by another brother, James, when the older children were already in school. Their home expanded accordingly, with additions built onto the original structure to accommodate their growing family and Thea's collection of books, which had become something of a lending library for the town. Caleb's horse training business flourished, his reputation for fairness and skill spreading beyond Aurora to neighboring communities. Thea continued teaching, eventually becoming the head teacher at Aurora's expanded school, where she implemented progressive educational methods that drew attention from as far away as Denver. They faced challenges, of course, harsh winters that threatened their livestock, economic downturns that affected the entire region, the normal trials of raising 3 spirited children in a frontier community. But through it all, they faced each obstacle together, their partnership only strengthened by the difficulties they overcame. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb surprised Thea by taking her back to the wildflower meadow where their courtship had truly begun. though the children had been left in Mrs. Winslow's capable hands for the day. The picnic Caleb had packed was elaborate enough for a small army. "Remember the first time we came here?" he asked as they sat among the flowers, which were just as spectacular as they had been a decade earlier. "Of course," Thea replied, leaning against his shoulder. "I was still trying to decide between you and Philip." Caleb chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her. "Think you made the right choice?" She looked up at him, taking in the face that had become so dear to her, the laugh lines around his eyes, the touch of gray at his temples, the scar near his jawline from a fall he'd taken breaking a particularly stubborn colt the previous year. "I've never doubted it for a moment," she said truthfully. "Not even when you tracked mud all over my clean kitchen floor last week." He laughed outright at that, pulling her into a kiss that still held all the passion of their early days together. When they separated, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. "What's this?" she asked, accepting the gift. "Open it and see." Inside was a delicate silver locket. When she opened it, she found a tiny painting on one side, the wildflower meadow in full bloom, and on the other, a perfect miniature portrait of their 3 children, painted by the traveling artist who had visited Aurora the previous month. "Caleb, it's beautiful," she breathed, immediately fastening it around her neck. "Thought you should have something to mark 10 years, he said simply. "Though doesn't seem nearly long enough, considering all we've done." Thea leaned against him, content in a way she had never imagined possible back when she was burning Philip's letters behind the livery stable. "We've built quite a life, haven't we?" "And we're just getting started," he replied, his arm tightening around her waist. That evening, as they rode back toward their home where the windows glowed with welcoming light, and they could already hear their children's excited voices greeting Mrs. Winslow's return, Thea reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the ashes of broken promises had risen something far more precious and enduring. A love built on honesty and mutual respect, a family that was the center of her world, and a community where she had found her true purpose. The letters she had burned that day long ago had freed her to find where she truly belonged, not in Philadelphia or Denver or any eastern city, but here in Aurora, beside the cowboy who had watched those ashes blow away and seen in her the possibility of a future neither of them had dared to dream. As Caleb helped her dismount in the yard of their home, Christopher burst through the front door, followed closely by Alina and little James, all clamoring to share the adventures of their day. Laughing, Thea gathered her children close, meeting Caleb's eyes over their heads, a look of shared joy and gratitude for the life they had created together. This, she thought, was what it meant to find one's true home. Not a place, but people. Not a destination, but a journey shared. And though the path had been unexpected, she wouldn't change a single step that had led her here to this man, these children, this life that had grown from the scattered ashes of what might have been into something far more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. As the years continued to pass, Aurora grew from a frontier settlement into a proper town with a rail station, several churches, and a brick schoolhouse where Thea eventually became principal. Caleb expanded his horse business to include breeding, with their eldest son, Christopher, showing a natural talent for working with the animals that surpassed even his father's considerable skills. Their daughter Alina revealed a gift for learning that matched her mother's, devouring books at an astonishing rate, and eventually continuing her education at a women's college in Denver, a separation that was difficult for the close-knit family, but necessary for her growth. Young James, always the most adventurous of the 3, combined his father's outdoorsman abilities with his mother's quick intelligence in ways that both delighted and occasionally terrified his parents. When Thea was 45 and Caleb 50, they welcomed their first grandchild, Christopher's daughter, whom he and his wife named Theodora in honor of her grandmother. Holding the tiny girl in her arms, Thea marveled at the continuity of life, at how the story she and Caleb had begun continued to unfold in ways they could never have predicted. "Suits her," Caleb remarked, peering over her shoulder at the infant. "Got your eyes." "And Christopher's chin," Thea added, "which means she has yours." They shared a smile, the kind that needed no words after nearly 25 years together, a smile that acknowledged all they had built and all that would continue after them. On a clear autumn evening much like the one when they had first met, Thea stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Caleb joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the growing chill. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, slipping an arm around her waist. "I was thinking about those letters," she admitted, leaning into his embrace. "The ones I was burning when you found me. Been a long time since you mentioned those." "I know." She turned to face him. "I was thinking how grateful I am that you were there that day, that you saw something worth knowing in a woman who was trying to burn away her past." Caleb's eyes, still the same stormy gray that had captivated her all those years ago, softened with understanding. "I saw a woman with the courage to start over," he corrected gently. "Same woman I see every day, just with a few more miles behind her now." Thea laughed, the sound carrying across the land they had tended together for a quarter-century. "More than a few, I think." "Best miles of my life," he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. As they stood together watching darkness settle over their piece of Colorado, Thea thought about the young woman she had been, hurt and angry, feeding love letters to flames behind a stable in a town she barely knew. How could that woman have imagined the life that awaited her? The love that would heal her heart and the family that would fulfill it beyond measure. The ashes of those letters had long since scattered to the winds, but what had grown from them remained strong and enduring, like the mountains that guarded their horizon and the love that had built their home. "Come inside," she said to Caleb, taking his hand as she had countless times before. "Eleanor's letter should have arrived today, and Christopher and his family are coming for dinner tomorrow. We have plans to make." Together, they walked into the warm light of their home, their story continuing to unfold with each step forward, not an ending, but a constant, beautiful beginning that renewed itself with each passing day.